Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Susanne Etti, and I'm joining you today virtually from Naarm, Melbourne. I lead Intrepid's climate action work, including carbon performance, reporting, and transitioning the business for the low-carbon economy. Measurement to net zero is a big topic, and we know this is the area travel companies often struggle with or don't know where to start. I will give a first introduction to the topic, but certainly it is not complete. As I call in from Melbourne, Australia, I like to do an acknowledgement of country. An acknowledgement of country is a statement that shows awareness of and respect for the traditional custodians of the land I'm on and their continuing relationship with the land. I live on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I like to pay my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this meeting takes place, and also pay my respect to elders both past and present. As we share our knowledge, teaching and practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. For tens of thousands of years, First Nations people have managed the land and its inhabitants to ensure environmental harmony and sustainability. Keeping balance in the environment is central to First Nations ways of thinking and being. People only take what is needed so natural resources are not depleted. And when something is taken from the environment, something must be added elsewhere. This equilibrium is shown in many First Nation practices like ceremony, agriculture, and land management. The tourism industry is at the forefront of the climate emergency. We have a front row seat to the crisis that is unfolding in many iconic natural areas and destinations across the globe. At the same time, before COVID hit, the sector contributed to 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Individually and collectively, as a global industry, we are all feeling the effects of new extreme weather patterns and events. Climate change could see these tourism-dependent communities displaced and their livelihoods lost. It also presents a growing risk and cost to all travel businesses. At the same time, tourism is one of the industries most severely impacted by COVID-19. We believe this period will redefine tourism for the future. While COVID-19 is not a solution for climate change, it is a catalyst for more ambitious climate action to reduce emissions and transform our industry. We are seeing many more companies committing to carbon neutrality, and that's great, but being carbon neutral, this is no longer enough. Based on the facts we know today, we'll be lying to ourselves if we were to continue as though being carbon neutral is enough for the travel industry. The sooner business starts working on structural changes and an emissions trajectory in line with a 1.5-degree world, the more beneficial the changes to the business. Ambitious targets do not hinder business. Science-based greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets help drive innovation and real operational emissions reductions. Offsetting corporate emissions with carbon offset units is a valuable climate action to date, but it relies on emission reductions that are achieved elsewhere in compensation for business as usual. The depth of structural change in the economy required to limit global warming to 1.5-degree world will require everyone, countries, cities, the private sector, individuals to strengthen their action without delay, leaving very little to no room to outsource climate action in the future. The infographic demonstrates that even though offsets compensate for a company's business as usual greenhouse gas emissions, they alone do not result in actual emissions reductions for the company over time. Furthermore, purchasing offsets are unlikely to remain a financially viable option with most projections foreseeing shortages of units in the market and steep increases in costs per unit. The earlier business starts working on structural changes and emissions trajectory in line with a 1.5-degree world, the less disruptive and more beneficial the changes to the business practice will be. In line with climate projections and explicit warnings from the scientific community to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, companies are increasingly expected to set emissions reduction targets in line with climate science and achieve emission reductions in company operations and the wider value chain through meaningful actions and investments. Carbon neutrality via the purchasing of carbon credit units compensating for the company's greenhouse gas emissions from its operations will not be enough going forward, although offsets are still expected to play a role. If using offset projects, it is important to ensure those projects deliver social, cultural, economic, and/or environmental benefits, and to focus on the removal of carbon credits to neutralize residual emissions at net zero. The first part of any carbon management strategy is for businesses and organizations to account for their greenhouse gas emissions generated by their activity, such as fuel or electricity use and travel. But how do companies start to understand its current situation? Measuring carbon emission is not an easy task. However, identifying and quantifying CO2 emissions helps to identify excessive energy usage or other inefficiencies. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol establishes comprehensive global standardized frameworks to measure and manage greenhouse gas emissions from private and public sector operations, value chain, and mitigation actions. Greenhouse gas accounting is conducted on an annual basis where emissions are first measured, for instance, which establish the inventory base year, and then measured year on year going forward for comparison and progress tracking. The time period selected for the greenhouse gas inventory can be calendar year, financial year, or other set periods such as quarterly reporting. A note on terminology. The terms of carbon accounting and greenhouse gas accounting is often used interchangeably. Even though we account for all 7 greenhouse gases during the accounting process, each with their own respective global warming potential, all 7 gases are brought back to the common unit of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. This is why sometimes you hear the term carbon footprint of a product or organization, but in reality, the greenhouse gas accounting has been brought back to the common unit of tons of CO2 equivalent for ease of comparison. Carbon dioxide has the lowest global warming potential compared to the other 6 greenhouse gases, but it is the most abundant gas in terms of atmospheric presence, hence why it forms the common unit in greenhouse gas accounting. If significant changes are made to the business, such as mergers or acquisitions or significant changes in the calculation methodology of the greenhouse gas inventory over time, then this may trigger a recalculation of the base year. The very first step in greenhouse gas accounting is to define the boundary of the greenhouse gas inventory. These are imaginary lines encompassing the emissions to include in an organization's greenhouse gas inventory. There are organizational boundaries which determine which company operations to include, and operational boundaries which determine which emission sources to include and how to categorize them. Using the guidance as set out by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard, there are three distinct consolidation approaches for setting the boundary. And these are the equity share approach, the operational control approach, and the financial control approach. The most common consolidation approach is that of operational control. That is, the controlling corporation has the full ability to introduce and enforce operating policies and procedures at the facility, office, or operations location. If a company has operational control, then it is responsible to account for 100% of the greenhouse gas emissions from that facility, office, or operations locations. Here's an example for an organizational boundary, including emissions from corporate business activities across global offices, including virtual offices. In an office annual carbon assessment, one, for example, captures the usage of electricity, water, gas, waste, air travel, working from home, and employee commuting. Not shown here, but important to consider for the reporting boundaries for the hotel's carbon footprint. This requires hotels to report on all greenhouse gas emissions resulting from activities within their premises, and if applicable, from outsourced laundry operations, for instance. This includes restaurants, meeting spaces, shops, garden spaces, fitness centers, back of house, and any other amenities that are located within the hotel's premises. Here's an example from Intrepid. What you see here is the product service process diagram for our tours. Attributable processes are defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol product standard as a service, material, and energy flows that become the product, make the product, and carry the product throughout its life cycle. Intrepid includes the emissions from Intrepid travel branded trips, both in Australia and internationally, into its boundary. The company has included its tours to over 130 countries, regions, and sub-regions across different travel comfort categories called trip styles. The trips can furthermore be classified through different travel themes like walking, cycling, and sailing. Intrepid quantifies transport, upstream, downstream, and Intrepid's tours, electricity used in tours accommodation, and tours waste generation. Non-attributable processes are defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol product standard as services, materials, and energy flows which are not directly connected to the studied product or service during its life cycle, because they do not become the product or service, make the product or service, or directly carry the product or service through its life cycle. There are different sources for greenhouse gas emissions. For example, for running the offices, it includes water usage in kitchen and restrooms, electricity, waste, business flights, and printing brochures. But not all emissions are the same. Companies' greenhouse gas emissions are classified into 3 scopes. Scope 1, 2, and 3 is a way of categorizing the different kinds of carbon emissions a company creates in its own operations and in its wider value chain. Scope 1. This one covers the greenhouse gas emissions that a company makes directly, for example, while running its boilers and vehicles. Scope 2. These are the emissions it makes directly, like when the electricity or energy it buys for heating and cooling buildings is being produced on its behalf. Scope 3. Now here's where it gets tricky. In this category go all the emissions associated not with the company itself, but that the organization is indirectly responsible for, up and down its value chain. So for example, from buying products from its suppliers, and from its products when customers use them. This includes business travel, employee commuting, leasing of assets like cruise ships, flights within trips, transport of goods like outsourcing laundry. Laundry-associated emissions can make up a significant portion of a hotel's overall emissions. Scope 3 is nearly always the big one. All greenhouse gas calculations are brought back to the common metric of carbon dioxide equivalent. Activity data is the data collected from the company for the emissions activity occurring. This data is collected from the company. Then the activity data is multiplied by an emission factor, which is chosen based on the type of activity data available. Emission factors are presented in specific units, which are matched to the activity data present. Emission factors are informed by detailed studies and life cycle assessments and are published by various entities, including government agencies and intergovernmental organizations. Country-specific emission factors for grid electricity are published for some countries. For example, DEFRA published factors for the UK, and the Environmental Protection Agency published factors for the US. However, for most other countries, the best available factors are the composite electricity heat factors in CO2 emissions from fuel combustion published by the International Energy Agency. Some examples of common types of activity data and emissions are given here. Data can be used and gathered to inform a top-down approach to greenhouse gas accounting or a bottom-up approach. The considerations for each approach are shown in this infographic. Under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard, companies are advised to use a bottom-up approach. In some situations, depending on the desired outputs of the greenhouse gas accounting process, a top-down approach is also suitable, but usually for annual greenhouse gas reporting, a bottom-up approach is employed. Graphic here shows you the calculation process for developing emission factors for trips across microregions, styles and comfort for tour operators. First, gather activity data about individual trips from trip leaders. Second, quantify emissions from individual trips by applying relevant emission factors to the data. Calculate the emissions for each trip in kilogram CO2 equivalent per passenger day. Third, list the emissions for every trip analyzed, then accumulate emissions factors based on location, microregion, and trip styles. Basic trips, comfortable high-end trip, or a sailing trip, for instance. Fourth point, generate a list of all trips taken in the reporting year, ensuring the list includes the trip code, the microregion, the style, the number of passengers on the trips, including your leaders, number of days on the trip. Fifth point, apply the emission factors to the list of trips taken in the reporting year by matching microregion and style. An example of how emissions are calculated this way is presented here. Step 1. Trip A is in Northern Africa and it's a basic trip. Reports show that in the reporting year there were 10 trips taken, which had a total of 50 passengers, including leaders, and the total days for all trips in the period was 100. Step 2. The emission factor for basic trips in Northern Africa is calculated as 15 kilogram CO2 equivalent per passenger day. Step 3. Emissions calculated for trip A in the reporting year is 50 passengers times the 100 days times the emission factor, giving us 75 tons of CO2 equivalent. Sum the total emissions for all passengers and days on every trip code taken in the reporting period and get a total number of emissions and your total carbon footprint for your trips. Hotel Carbon Measurement Initiative is a free methodology and tool for hotels to calculate the carbon footprint of hotel stays and meetings in their properties, which is using a different approach by looking, for instance, at the carbon footprint per occupied room on a daily basis. Greenhouse gas reporting is an opportunity for business to be transparent. Complete and accurate greenhouse gas emissions disclosures provide greater clarity for all stakeholders, enabling better decision-making. Greenhouse gas reporting encourages your business to operate as efficiently as possible and improve the areas where you aren't. Once you become aware of how much energy you use and how you manage your resources, you'll begin to find ways to reduce operating costs, make processes more efficient, and eliminate waste. Greenhouse gas accounting allows you to manage your risk and identify opportunities. The process of taking count of all your greenhouse gas emissions, even the optional ones, gives you a complete picture of your business. For instance, calculating a carbon footprint helps hotels to understand the link between how they operate and why they consume and what they consume in terms of energy and fuels, and the impact on the environment through carbon emissions. Being able to not only have a total carbon footprint and a footprint per occupied room, but also see they split down into the different sources enables, for instance, a hotel to prioritize their action and think about the types of energy they use in the hotel. Through the 2015 Paris Agreement, world governments committed to limiting global temperatures rise to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial level and pursuing efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, warned that global warming must not exceed 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change. To achieve this, greenhouse gas emissions must halve by 2030 and drop to net zero by 2050. The Science Based Targets initiative drives ambitious climate action in the private sector by enabling companies to set science-based emissions reduction targets. The Science Based Targets initiative is a partnership between CDP, the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resource Institute, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature. The Science Based Targets initiative call to action is one of the We Mean Business Coalition commitments. Science-based targets show companies how much and how quickly business need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to prevent the worst impacts of climate change, leading them on a clear path towards decarbonization. Selecting the right science-based target approach requires knowledge of the company's future business as usual, greenhouse gas trajectory, and an understanding of the emission hotspots in the inventory. What are the main emissions drivers, for instance, and where can significant emission reductions initiatives be implemented to ultimately achieve the set science-based target? The right approach also depends on the company's size, business type, and industry, where there are specific methodologies for certain sectors. Under the Science Based Targets initiative, a company must set Scope 1 and 2 targets in line with climate science. If a company's Scope 3 emissions triggers the Science-Based Target Scope 3 threshold, for instance, Scope 3 emissions constitute greater than 40% of the entire inventory, then a Scope 3 target must also be set. The illustration here is a high-level summary of the different considerations in setting a science-based target for Scope 1 and 2 and Scope 3, plus overall considerations. Important to note that at present, there is no sectoral decarbonisation approach for the tourism travel sector. The only available option is an absolute Scope 1 and 2 target. Well below 2 degrees Scope 1 and 2 targets will be gradually phased out from the target validation framework for companies and financial institutions. Companies that had targets approved in 2020 or earlier will have until 2025, as per the current Science-Based Target Initiative criteria, to update their targets. Companies that have been approved after that date will need to review and update their targets at least every 5 years. All companies and financial institutions that submit targets from the 15th of July 2022 will need to align to the new criteria of 1.5 degrees. The use of offsets must not be counted as emissions reduction towards the progress of a company's science-based targets. The Science-Based Target Initiative requires companies to set targets based on emission reduction through direct action within their own operation and/or their value chains. Offsets are only considered to be an option for companies wanting to finance additional emission reductions beyond their science-based targets. Science-Based Target Initiative has resources for companies at all stages of the target setting journey on their website. The depth of structural change in the economy required to limit global warming to 1.5 degree world will require everyone, countries, cities, the private sector, individuals, to strengthen their action without delay, leaving very little to no room to outsource climate action in the future. The earlier business starts working on structural changes and an emission trajectory in line with a 1.5 degree world, the less disruptive and more beneficial the changes to the business practice will be. We know that setting ambitious targets is in own self-interest. Science-based greenhouse gas emission reduction targets can help to drive innovation and secure long-term competitive advantage and drive real operational emission reductions. Setting long-term, meaningful targets sends a clear signal to all stakeholders, not just shareholders, as to where a company is heading and provides the context for strategic investment needed to transform business models. Business has a vital role to play in driving down greenhouse gas emissions and building the resilient zero emissions economy we urgently need. This action must be grounded in science. Thank you.